Just want to let you guys know, it does have some animal suffering in it, so go ahead and skip to the next story if you don't like that sort of thing. Otherwise, we'll get started now every fall. I take my family and I out to a cabin up in the woods. In Maine, don't let the whole cabin in the woods thing fool you, though. It's a very bougie kind of experience. And although my kids would roll their eyes at me using that word, I don't think they'd be quite so pleased with the place if it wasn't for how a market actually is as a hot tub outside, a full kitchen, pretty spectacular internet for rural Maine. But I think my favorite part has to be the cozy TV area with its fireplace and fancy sliding glass doors face out west. And because the cabin is built in a clear ring at the crest of a gentle slope, the sunsets are absolutely incredible. Paying for a hot tub is one thing, but seeing the way the setting sun lights up the red and orange leaves and makes them look like they're on fire, that's something money can't buy right there. And by some horrid twist of fate, though no sliding glass doors ended up being part of one of the scariest things I've ever seen with my own 2 eyes, they both protected us and presented us with a sight so horrifying. I don't think I can ever get it out of my mind. Every time we visit that luxurious log cabin up in Maine, it pops up into my mind like it just happened, and it's guaranteed to make me shudder. So we're gonna go back more than 10 years for this, all the way back to 2010. My daughter was still in middle school, and my son was only just out of diapers me, and my wife had just put my son to bed, and my daughter was up in her room playing that Nintendo thing we just gotten for her birthday for the first time on that day. Me and my wife are just enjoying each other's company in the TV room, watching the sunset and sharing a bottle of wine. We were gazing out the glass doors, silently basking and how much we'd overcome to be where we were now, when suddenly this dog walked into view. Looked like a mongrel of sorts, just lazily wandering into our view. It stopped and let its tongue loll out of its mouth in the way those dogs tend to do. My wife said something like, "Oh, look at that little guy, you think he's lost," or something. The dog seemed to hear her talking, though, as it turned its head in our direction. That's when I noticed there was something not quite right about this dog. Its ribs were showing clearly, which made me think it must be a stray. But then I noticed those flecked white spittle around its mouth. Some was mounted into the fur at the corner of its jaws. Even my wife, being the kind-hearted soul that she is, asked if we should open the door and give the poor thing some food in a bowl of water, since she too thought it looked like a stray. She was halfway around to getting up off the couch when I put a hand on her thigh and told her to sit back down at first. She acted like I was being some sort of Scrooge, not wanting to feed and water this starving animal. But when I told her the dog clearly had rabies, she suddenly understood why I didn't want to open those glass doors. After she sat back down, I took a closer look at the thing, just to make sure I wasn't being overly paranoid. As I took a step towards the glass, though, the dog began baring its teeth and snarling so loud we could hear it through the thick glass of the doors. By immediately frozen fear, amazed that even though it looked like nothing more than a domesticated dog, its anger could have such a profound effect on me. Truly looked ferocious. I can tell I wanted to rip my throat out, and I realized how fortunate we are in that moment. A friendly disposition, rather than antagonize any further, we tried to get away as far as possible, intending to find my phone and call animal control. The second I turned to show my back, though, it began bounding towards us. something I never would have known if it wasn't for my wife shouting, "Oh my God," at the top of her lungs. I turned around, just in time to see the dog's face collide with the glass door. It made such an ungodly thudding sound that it makes my skin crawl just thinking about it today. The impact to another frightened cry from my wife, which in turn had my daughter running into the room. To see what was wrong in that moment, my priority was getting my daughter out of there, so she wouldn't have to see what was happening. It was extremely distressing, even for us grown adults. So I can only imagine disturbing it would be to see for a child. There was a slight smear of blood on the glass, and the dog began walking in a dazed circle outside. My daughter began crying, and though I was sorry to do it, I yelled at her to get out of the room. My next priority was obviously animal control. Through the glass, certainly not after that first attempt, but after I dialed the operator and asked them to connect me with animal control. I watched in as the dog began to literally bite its way through the glass. It was raking its teeth against it, its fat, swollen tongue lolling out the whole time. That's when I realized it wasn't just hot or thirsty. Its tongue was so big it couldn't actually sit in its mouth properly. Blood was leaking out of it, with it smearing everywhere as it continued to try and bite its way, break through. At the same time, a look would come into its eyes every so often that to me looked like desperation. There was nothing we could do. I'm not the type to keep a gun in the house. All I could do was wait for animal control to call us back. They weren't picking up the phone immediately. Then we tell them where exactly we were and what condition we'd seen the dog in. It did wander off long. Before the call came, my wife had barely managed to calm down. In that time, I can't say that I did a much better job calming down. Either, like I said, it was one of the most horrifying things I'd ever been witness to in the years that followed. My daughter became a huge fan of the TV show, Stalker. I was always surprised she didn't make the connection between the virus and that show and what she'd seen at the cabin that day. Naturally, we had to explain to her that the dog was rabid, how the disease works, and how dangerous it is, and how she should learn to recognize the symptoms of such animals and never come near them personally. I find it very fascinating that people like her take an interest in a fictional zombie apocalypse and talk about it like it's an impossibility. We already have zombie viruses here on Earth, multiple of them.
Like and subscribe horror
They actually exist. They can turn animals and even people into furious, foam-frothing creatures that can pass their disease through their bites. You don't really have to imagine it. It's already here with us. Foreign that night. It was last year, and I had just turned 25. I had been to a friend's wedding in another state and was returning by train. I reached the station around 5 p.m. It was freezing outside, and it was freezing outside as the temperature had just hit 4 degrees. All I could think about was getting home fast so I could sleep. For hours after being tired for many nights, I generally avoid in the dark, but it was impossible to wait at the station all the way till sunrise. Even 1 hour seemed like it would be a very long time. I decided to call up a taxi. The distance from the station to my apartment was roughly 40 kilometers. There were 2 taxis, and I got into one of them without even making eye contact with the driver. I told him where I wanted to go, and we started. The man must have been in his late 50s or early 60s, silver gray hair, big build. I decided to go with this taxi because I thought I'd be more safe with this fellow since he was an elderly man. Clearly, that was a mistake. Nearly 15 to 20 minutes had passed. I was looking at the road ahead. There were very few cars out. All I could see were trees close by the fog covered everywhere else. Suddenly, I noticed that this guy had been staring at me from the rearview mirror. It didn't blink or look away when I looked at him. Either it had been over 2 minutes. And he was still staring at me, not even looking at the road ahead near these scary, droopy eyes that made me very uncomfortable at this point. I used my scarf to cover half my face. This didn't stop him, though. Instead, he suddenly started laughing like a maniac. Then he said some words in some language I don't understand. I asked him to repeat what he'd said, and my heart started beating very fast. So many people are dying. He said, and started laughing again. I was too afraid to ask him what he meant. I sat there frozen, regretting why I hadn't just waited at the station. My hands were shivering because I was trying to send a message to my friend. My fingers just wouldn't type properly. He turned around now, fully facing me, and asked if I was married. I managed to nervously say no. Then he said, "You will repent with these words." He started to speed up. My mind was going crazy now. What could he mean by that? Why would he just randomly say such a thing to me? I tried looking around to see if it was a good idea to hop out of that taxi. It was still very dark, though, and there weren't many cars around. There were maybe 2 or 3 cars that would pass by every 5 to 10 minutes. But by this point, I was convinced he was taking me to some other place. Maybe he wasn't. But I was too terrified to think straight. I was trembling with fear and was sure he was going to attack me or even do something worse. Suddenly, he slowed down greatly and started talking to himself. People die. You'll die. She'll die. With those words, he stopped the taxi right in the middle of the road and told me to get out, saying we needed fresh air and the petrol was out. I could tell he wasn't drunk, but appeared to be hallucinating. He kept blabbering and looking at the empty seat next to him, laughing for no reason. Arguing with him could make him annoyed, so I decided to do what he said until I got some help or could stop him in some other way. I got out of the taxi, and so did he. Now he was right in front of me, about a car-length distance away, holding a lit torch, playing with it by his neck and repeating over and over, "You will repent." I was almost crying with fear, running to be impossible. I could easily be run over by a passing car due to the fog, and my mind was not working properly at this point. The thought of calling someone didn't occur to me earlier, and now it was too risky. This maniac was right there holding that torch and moving around like he was possessed. It was like a scene from a horror movie. His eyes bulged out of his head in the torchlight that illuminated his serious face. He said something again, which I couldn't understand. I was extremely restless, looking around everywhere for help. To my relief, there was a car passing by. It stopped right there, looking at us standing in the middle of the road. The random passerby stopped and came running to me. He asked me to come back to his car, or his daughter, who was nearly my age, opened the door and let me inside. The insane cab driver just ran back to his taxi and sped off in seconds. I was still breathing heavily and told them what had happened in the last 30 to 40 minutes. They told me I was going in the opposite direction of my destination. It was not a safe area either, since many incidents had already occurred with girls. In that area, I was right that driver had been taking me to some other place. They explained that they'd noticed something was wrong. The way the man was just standing there holding that torch and the light shining on my silhouette, they decided to check what was going on. Had they not stopped, I doubt I'd be alive to tell of this incident, since that night I never travel alone at night, again unthankful to those people who saved my life. Sometimes we see many people who say they need help, but we fear it could be something sinister. So we just pass on by, and they thought the same thing. I'd surely be dead. My sisters, and I, of which I have 3, grew up in a smallish country town in rural Australia. You could probably imagine there was not a whole lot going on there. One by one, we jumped ship and moved on to greener pastures, in this instance, bigger, more exciting cities. This story is not mine. It's my younger sister's. When it came time for her to follow suit and move out, she followed the rest of us to Sydney at the time. This story takes place when was 19 years old at her first work Christmas party. Not long after she arrived in town, she got slightly intoxicated, not knowing the city very well. She opted to pay for a taxi in order to get home safely. She left the party, flagged one down, and jumped in the front seat next to the driver. She advised her destination and began making play conversation. As she tells it, the driver was fine at first, but before too long, he began turning the conversation to her looks and her job, telling her she was gorgeous and asking if she did any modeling. She laughed it off and told them no. It was at this point that while driving the taxi, it reached underneath his seat and pulled out a camera, snapping photos. His compliments grew increasingly cruder. She asked him to stop taking pictures of her before getting angry and yelling at him to stop the taxi and let her out right now, which he refused to do, thinking quickly. She looked to see if there were any red lights coming up ahead where he would have to stop the car. Luckily, there was one fast, approaching the driver, slowed down, gradually, rather than driving to the light and stopping, all the while continuing to take photos of her with one hand. When he was finally moving slow enough, she felt like she could exit the car without injuring herself. She opened the door and jumped out. It was moving slowly enough at that point that thankfully she was not injured, intoxicated, scared, and lost. She sat in the gutter briefly to collect herself before finally coming to the realization she had no idea where she was. She would have to get another taxi in order to get home. Reluctantly, she flagged down another car, this time getting in the back seat and once again advising her destination. The driver of the second car saw she'd been crying and was visibly shaken up, asked her what had happened and if she was all right. She explained the events. The driver paused for a moment before gently informing her that the first driver had been taking her the complete opposite direction of where she had told him. She needed to go. Attempts were made to find out who this guy was and report him. However, as my sister was drunk and new to the city, she was not able to provide enough specific information. Location, exact time, taxi company, description of the driver, etc. Since this incident, whenever she has no other option to get a taxi home, the first thing she does after getting in the car is take a photo of the driver's license with her phone. It makes my skin crawl to think that the guy who did this is more than likely driving taxis in the city, and that this is heralded as the safest way to get home if you're a young woman and it's late at night. Yeah, So when I was a kid, maybe 6 or 7 in the mid-1990s, we took a family trip to the beach in Florida. We were staying in a beach house, a short walking distance away from the beach. When we went down to the beach, I was supposed to stay inside of my mom, but I'd wandered way down, and before I knew it, I was already lost. A lot of the houses looked the same, and I wasn't sure which one was ours. Plus, I couldn't see my mom. Anywhere it started to rain soon after I came upon a path that I was pretty sure would lead back. The house only, it didn't lead to a house at all, but instead a big parking lot. There was a single dirty van parked there. It was the only vehicle in sight. I was about to turn back when I noticed an overweight woman with brown hair, a hot pink tank top, and those big, clunky, thick glasses that were popular in the 80s weaving, and smiling at me, passenger seat of the van. She called out to me, "Oh my, it's raining so hard. Where's your mommy? Let us take you to her. It's dangerous to be out here in the rain. You could get struck by lightning or something." She was very friendly, almost overtly. So in the driver's seat was a very overweight man as well, without a shirt on his hairy gray chest, was wearing a clunky-looking gold chain. He was wearing yellow-tinted Elvis shades as well and staring at me very intently. He was smoking a cigarette, which I knew was a bad thing to do. The woman stepped out of the van and kneeled down next to me. She asked me how old I was. When I told her honestly, she gleefully remarked, "Oh my, we have 2 boys your age at our house. You should come over and spend the night. We've got movies, Nintendo in the morning. We've got all kinds of sugary cereal." I'd been taught all about stranger danger, but at this point in my life, no adult had ever given me any reason not to trust them. The lady continued talking about stuff. "The boys have go-karts, and they drink chocolate milk or something like that." She tried to make it seem as enticing as possible for a 7-year-old kid. At this point, I was starting to trust her mostly. I liked the idea of getting to play with other kids my age. Then I remembered, though, that I needed to ask my mom first. I told her this, and she told me that was no problem. They lived just up the road, and my mom shouldn't mind that short a distance. It started raining even harder. She opened the sliding door of the van and said something like, "Now, let's get you out of this rain and go find your mommy." I knew, logically, that I shouldn't do this, but the lady just seemed so nice. I was desperately wanting to get out of the rain, as well as I walked toward the open door of the van, though I noticed an awful stench that almost made me gag. This set off alarm bells in my head that something was not quite right here. There were cigarette butts all over the floor. I looked up. The fat man, who was not only staring at me with menacing glare, but also had a creepy, toothy smile. His teeth were stained a dark yellow. I could pick up on a very up vibe coming from him even at that young age. I instantly knew that I should run, but the woman was ushering me to hurry up and get inside. Her demeanor immediately changed. She began demanding and even literally trying to push me and pick me up and shoved me into the van. She started to sound angry. "Get thee in already," she said in a tone that was completely opposite of how she'd sounded before I jumped to the side and started running as fast as I could go. Some woman managed to grab my wrist, but somehow I was able to slip free and run back to the beach. I think she tried to chase me, but like I'd said, she was very overweight, so she couldn't keep up for long. I made it back to my mom, who was obviously freaking out. I tried explaining what had happened to me, but I don't think at 7 years old that I was able to convey the gravity of what had happened to me. and I didn't even fully understand it.